if you did put them the Mount Everest of logistical problems of giving incarcerated serial killers psychedelics, if you just push that to the side for a second, it does theoretically, seem like a really good treatment for them, because there's almost no better way, I think, that we've seen in terms of having global rewiring and change of brain, in terms of behavior, in terms of thought patterns, in terms of helping them rethink things. The no-go stop cognitive control test. What exactly is that? Like, if we take a psychopath behaviorally in the world, like, what is that test extrapolating that makes it so predictive in your view?
Yeah, so the task is essentially you're pressing a button for some stimuli and trying not to press for others. And so it's an X and a K. So they look very similar. But as you're doing this and you're going fast and the stimuli come pretty quickly and randomly, so they're jittered, if you will. It's a tough task and you will make mistakes. It's designed so that everyone will make some mistakes. Individuals with psychopathic traits tend to make a few more mistakes. That is, their systems don't tend to adapt and learn from this as quickly, and so they tend to make more mistakes. And that's the analog to how they behave in the community, is that they tend to get out there and not pay attention to these signals that tell them to stop doing what they're doing, or to be less impulsive. And so that's the analog. There's of course thousands of papers on go-no-go tasks in all forms of what we call disinhibitory psychopathology. So people that have impulse control disorders are often showing abnormalities. We publish papers on people that have obsessive compulsive thoughts, and even up to hoarding kind of thoughts, where you worry a lot about things. And so that circuit basically just fires. It's like twice as big of a system. It's like overreactive. But the individuals with psychopathy, they're underreactive. They just don't worry about something. I mean, this is another thing that's going in my next book, but if you want to get a psychopath to look at you funny, ask him if he's ever worried about leaving the oven on. And he'll go, what?
Wow.
What? Why would I? They look at you like you've asked them, like from another planet or something, because that's never been a thought that's come into their head. They just don't ruminate and worry about things like that. And so it's a very telling kind of process.
That stress response has got to be different then, is it right? They must have just not the same sort of cortisol response from like, oh my God, I left the oven on, like I'm going to damage something I own, like that cognitive process, that stress response that most people have, they must just not have.
So the worry is not there. The rumination, the worry is gone. Yeah, there's no sense of worry. Yeah, they don't worry about anything.
And even if they don't worry about getting caught to them, like in the case where they left the oven on there, it's only them that's going to maybe pay the consequences of that if they burn their own house down. They don't even care then.
Yeah, I would probably share with you that most psychopaths will never have the credit score to get a house. So they're not going to really own one if they score in that really high range.
Gotcha.
And so there's going to be a rental thing, but I don't even think that even comes into play. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
Like they just don't worry about those types of things. And so whereas, the average person might worry about it. I often worry about our gas barbecue that we have is connected directly to the main. And so if I left it on the barbecue, it could go for weeks and I wouldn't know, and it'd be a bill coming, And so I do often go check that at night after grilling, to make sure that it's all off. And, if anything, I should put a stop valve in there so that I can get in there and make sure that it's off. But it's, those types of things. That's just one example of I'm trying to share with you about how they are really different and really don't seem to have that. And it's really hard for people to grasp this because they're like, that's like just so different. It's so foreign. I don't know how I could think like that. And so, it's the same thing with the empathy is, I'll put up an equation, one of Einstein's field equations for the theory of general relativity. And I'll tell people, here, you want to know how a psychopath feels when you ask them, do they feel bad for what they did? And I put up this equation. I go, solve this. And people just stare at it blankly, right? You look at it blankly and you're like, I have no idea even where to start. Right. Well, that's how
such a good example. That's such a good,
don't feel
complete befuddlement.
Yeah. And I said, that's how they feel when you ask them about empathy. They don't have that skill.
Yeah.
They don't have that intrinsic, understanding or appreciation. And it's really people just, how is that possible? And you're like, whoa, that's this condition, and what's, I guess why I'm emphasizing this is that that's what's really different. I mean, there really aren't any other conditions that have that trait. So no other forms of psychopathology have as their central focus a lack of a lack of empathy, guilt, and remorse. Other conditions have impulsivity problems, and that's shared with psychopathy. There's common systems that appear to be dysregulated in that sense, and so whereas in the profound difference is there's this lack of concern or empathy that's really different.
Right.
Um, so yeah. Anyway, but back to the brain data, I think that people are becoming more accepting of this, especially well, that's one of the reasons why the Brain Age paper was so well, it got one of the fastest reviews ever. It was published in like a week from when we submitted it. And that's because there's people using and testing Brain Age in many other contexts. And so they're testing Brain Age to predict developmental course or academic scholastic aptitude, and they're using it to study a lot of aging related processes. And so the construct, the philosophy, the math is well developed. And
Right.
so people now, what we did is we just adapted it to a different population and a different outcome variable. And so everybody was like, yes, this totally makes sense. In fact, we weren't the first people to do Brain Age. I mean, other people came up with that idea, and now there's probably conferences dedicated to just the developments in Brain Age right now, and in its potential predictive utility. And people will decode age with many different modalities of the MRI. They'll try the structural, the diffusion. They'll study, the functional stuff. I mean, resting state, connectivity measures. We've published many papers that show that age is a great predictor of the networks, how they evolve and change over time, and how they get disrupted, by certain forces, especially like traumatic brain injury, et cetera. But there's just a tremendous amount of growth in studying those things and their replicability and generalization. So these are all, areas that continue to develop and grow. But
Yes.
yeah, I think that it's I think most people can kind of understand that, as long as you're not a dualist, so they understand that, your personality, your IQ, those things, they are instantiated in the brain. And if we can decode, if MRI is a good probe of it, well, then we'll be able to help find value in that data.
A thing that you mentioned a while ago that I wanted to go back to is you said that these brain changes, there's evidence that those brain changes go back to when they were maybe 10, 11, 12. I'm curious how we know that, and just to talk around that a little bit, because that kind of blows my mind. The order of causality is unclear when you measure a brain at 40 and you see a small amygdala, right? It's always the question of, does psychopathy create a small amygdala, or does a small amygdala create psychopathy or any other thing? So I'm curious to go back in time to adolescence.
Absolutely. So what I'll start with is the first paper we published, and now there have been many others like this, have shown that the amygdala is probably one of the most predictive structures in its relation to psychopathy. So the amygdala is what is the amygdala? The amygdala is a small almond-shaped structure in the brain that's got like 9 different nuclei in it. It's very responsive to fear and salient stimuli in the environment that you need to respond to or attend to. If it fires, it can often fire even before attention can be to that there was something there. Like, it's a reflexive, important, adaptive thing. And the amygdala is very sexually dimorphic, so it's much bigger in men than women, probably due to the evolutionary history of, and the need to be hunter-gatherer, hunting and doing that out, as you have to be more fast at processing, salient environmental stimuli, more than others, or fighting or other types of things. But the amygdala is one of the more replicable structures that is smaller in psychopathy. And so they're basically less responsive to fearful stimuli. They don't show the same kind of fear potentiated startle responses, especially affective startle. So they're not going to, and that structure is abnormal in the men that are 30 years old when we study them. So you ask the question perfectly. So if I live am I born that way, or is a 30-year history of chronic antisocial drug abuse and everything else led it to be smaller? So what we did is we took them, in their average age, I think, is 15. And these are kids in a supermax facility who are there, all of them for 85, 90% have felony convictions as youth, most of them for violent crimes. And in that sample of 202 boys, we found the same structural deficits. So by age 15, there was no difference. There's no aging effect between the 15 and 30-year-olds. It doesn't seem to get smaller. It's exactly the same. When you overlap the
Right.
histograms, they're the same. So that would suggest that at least by the age of 15, it's already crystallized. So the developmental processes or whatever has led it to be there. Now, I'm sure there are data, and I'm not that aware of it, but like the Abide data set, this is a longitudinal cohort sequentials from 2 to 30. We should track and see whether the amygdala is something that is changing in size over time, and whether or not there might be some critical window or impairment that could have caused it to stop or to not develop normally. But my guess, because we see this 30-year-olds and even 50 at this point, they have smaller amygdala, and down to 15, is that we would probably still be seeing that when you're younger. So as long as you measure the traits of psychopathy carefully, and then you will probably find that it's going to be smaller even as you get into the younger and younger ages. And that's because the behaviors were there, right? So they acted, they had these traits and behaviors from a very early age as well. How early can we go? I don't know.
Is there any evidence that any protocol can have actual brain wiring changes? Like over a certain amount of time, can we grow the amygdala? Can we restore gray matter to the orbitofrontal cortex? Can we improve emotional regulate? Like these sort of actual, we might have a
Yes.
great outcome in not offending, but can we actually make permanent brain changes that persist over a lifetime?
So, I mean, my answer to that would be yes. The brain is extremely plastic and it is very much capable of changing. There are certain medicines like SSRIs that are known in animal models to increase, neurogenesis in places like the amygdala. You can grow new neurons, and if you can be growing those neurons while you're doing an empathy-based treatment or a treatment that's trying to help have those neurons have value, if you will, in terms of how they might respond, then I think absolutely yes. And we do know that certain forms, just learning to juggle, for example, will rewire the brain. There was a couple of papers published years ago that showed that just juggling will change the way that the brain is connected. And so that's just a behavioral treatment, for a motor process and coordinated process. But the same thing we believe is true. And there have been little analyses now and a handful of studies on how mindfulness changes the brain. And then how mindfulness, if you keep and maintain it, and continue to use the skills, will have a very meaningful effect on outcomes, reducing substance use, relapse, reducing other behavioral problems, improving relationships, with others, and having you basically just stop and think about, the best possible outcome for yourself and the best possible outcome for the other people that you're there with. I do believe that there are opportunities to do this. In the prison system, there's a long history of people doing experiments and things that would never be repeated today, and so it can sometimes be a little bit of a challenge to implement kind of novel treatments or other things with these populations. But we are optimistic that we might be able to do things like transcranial direct current stimulation, which is used routinely in the community in community samples. It's FDA approved. And we believe that may be one treatment that we would like to study and see if that can help meaningfully change things, especially if it's done in conjunction with treatment. I've been approached by a variety of different psychiatric groups that have said they'd be interested in testing medicines, for psychopaths and seeing whether or not those medicines might work and how might we go about doing that. That's harder to do because the medicines, they might have a neurotropic effect. And if you combine them with a cognitive-based therapy at the same time, then hopefully we would see, positive outcomes and changes. But there are just certain rules that are difficult to get some of those things, implemented for good reasons. And might they be, potentially, valuable? Yeah. So I do think so. But right now, I think we have one treatment program we know works. I'd love to see it generalized or replicated in other states. I'd love to see it generalized to younger adults. So right now they're like 15, 16, 17. It'd be great to try it with 18, 19, 20-year-olds, and see if you can change them as well. And maybe it'll take a little longer because they're a little older, a little more set in their ways, if you will. But I do think that there's a lot of potential translational value to the imaging science. And I certainly hope that your audience understands that just because we see these brain predictors, that doesn't mean you can't change them. It doesn't at all.
It does give a sense of not free will, but that's not the full picture. That's not the right
No,
extrapolation. But the one that's
no.
screaming out to me that I'm curious that you didn't mention there is psychedelics. Sort of
Ah,
psychedelic therapy. So it's sort of, light bulbs are going off, and like in terms of if we want to give people compassion and empathy, like that could be that's one route that seems highly effective in typical people in giving them compassion and empathy and really rewiring the brain and having long-term effects on brain wiring is psychedelic therapy. But I'm curious, is there work done on psychedelics for psychopaths?
none that I know of. I mean,
Really
the difficulty, yeah, the challenge is
interesting.
that we can't. We're not allowed under the current ethical guidelines for research with prisoners. That's called the Office of Human Research Protections (OHRP). It currently prohibits, by statute, federal statute, any experimental drug treatment in prisoners. So
Right.
if the psychopaths were in the community, some sort of non-incarcerated sample, then you might get permission to do a treatment program like that. But to do it while they're incarcerated is likely to be uh, challenging.
I could
No,
imagine
ethically,
so.
I know it's interesting though is at this point you might say, well, listen, and there have been pushes again. There have been groups and American Psychiatric Association and other groups have said, if we want to make meaningful progress, we should try to do treatment trials and we should just have an external monitor that monitors for adverse events and other things. And it certainly has to be, voluntary and it certainly has to be these things. But given the advances, in the last 100 years, of psychiatric treatment, maybe psychedelics is one to start with, that why wouldn't we want to give people who wanted to take these treatments an opportunity to do this
Right.
and then to monitor and follow them, et cetera. So, I would be amenable to doing those types of studies and trying to understand how the brain changes with those treatments. Um, it's just a very big hurdle to get over, and you'd have
Right.
to have a lot of safety things in place, more than you would normally do in order to try to affect,
That makes
to
sense.
implement it.
The
But
logistical
but it,
issues, I'm sure, like I'm kind of disregarding the logistical issues, but like if you did put them,
sure,
the Mount Everest of logistical problems of giving incarcerated serial killers psychedelics, if you just push that to the side for a second, it
yeah,
does theoretically, seem like a really good treatment for them because there's almost no better way, I think, that we've seen in terms of having global rewiring and change of brain in terms of behavior, in terms of thought patterns, in terms of helping them rethink things that negative thought patterns they might have. Just on so many levels, psychedelic seems like the right treatment, but I agree, logistically very hard and complicated for everyone involved.
yeah. I mean, honestly, it's not that challenging of a. I mean, it could be done. It just takes a system that wants to be progressive and do it first, and and do it to put together kind of an ethical board and framework of people that would be antagonistic to it, and then to say like, this is our plan. How would you want us to implement this so that it was considered to be ethical and safe and fair? But the population really only exists within this incarcerated sample. There, you
Yeah,
you just don't find it's. I think it would be literally impossible to try to do this treatment in a community because they just won't show up for treatment, and so then it really only works because of where they are and that they're accessible. I think that I would be happy to participate in discussions and processes and what I really can share with you is that when the researchers come to them and we're independent from corrections, there's no downside to saying no, if they don't want to do anything, but they're happy to, when they're free to make those choices, even in the system, in a correctional system, that, the inmates really do enjoy the research. They really do enjoy participating. They often, we had one warden who did an analysis and showed that the men that volunteered for treatment and research that we were doing had less institutional infractions than the population that didn't volunteer. And he was like, so
interesting.
what I'm seeing is that the research has a very positive effect on the facility, giving them something, positive to go do that they enjoy, that they want to go do is seen as a good thing. And I think if you implemented the right framework and the right, the scaffolding around doing a treatment program like that with psychedelics or whatever medicines might work, I do think it could be done ethically and it could be done well. Um, it's just going to take, you know,
Yeah.
um, it would be a bit of a challenge to try to do that. But I think it should be done. I think that that's a way to try to make meaningful progress. And it doesn't have to be in the ultra highest risk guys too. It can just be in those that are in the higher range, but are likely to get released. And
Exactly.
so then you might want to see how they're going to behave, you know, study how they're going to behave. You know, I can tell you that I think most of them would volunteer for the treatment. You know, they're whether or not it's a wait list control or a randomized clinical trial with different types of medicines. I know that they would probably be interested in trying. Um, you know,
Sure to help
especially
be
if
sitting in their cell all day to get to
well,
get
that's the
comfortable with
challenge is
psilocybin
that
for a day.
yeah, and again, that's one of the challenges is that it's that sitting in their cell and that kind of stuff does not allow them to have the same amount of free choice to participate as somebody who's in the community who can just, you know, never
Yeah.
respond to the question. And so how do you balance that autonomy and that ability there? So again, I think that it's a I think it can be managed, especially if you implement it carefully without them feeling like they have to participate. But you know, there are people that differ in that opinion, and so then it just comes down to how do you how might the rules change to try to allow, you know, that kind of work. And yeah, so
Like my
yeah.
my absolutely no data to support this guess would be that if you were wanted to reduce reoffending the absolute most, what you would do is MDMA trauma therapy and try tackle that really deep trauma that seems to be so correlated in cases of psychopaths, something that happened in their childhood, sexual abuse, violent abuse. If you tried to go to the very core of the emotional issues with MDMA in a sequence of trials again and again, I have to believe that that would be highly effective. Now, expensive, maybe controversial, I don't know. Again, lots of logistical issues, but that seems like the right way to do it if you're really trying to cure these people.
Yeah, and I guess I'll share with you that I mean we've published many papers on this type of work, and there's absolutely no doubt that offenders generally experience way more trauma, polytrauma, both
Yes.
environmental based stuff, so living in neighborhoods and places that they see a lot of bad things happen, and it causes, you know, significant distress, to the interpersonal side of trauma where they're being having parents or bad events happen to them, etc. It's environmental trauma that appears to be most related to psychopathic traits. We don't tend to see that the factor one traits, the interpersonal and affective traits, appear to be driven by trauma data. So that's kind of, you know, an interesting, you know, thing. So it seems to be, but nevertheless, the trauma is present in every single forensic person that I've ever worked with would benefit from some form of trauma-based therapy, would
Right.
benefit from that. And whether or not it's caused internalizing problems, meaning depression or anxiety, or maybe the trauma has pushed people towards more of the externalizing spectrum, either way that it goes, I think that they would benefit from trauma therapy. And so that is certainly part of the therapies that people are provided in prisons, but I think it could be done at a much wider level.
Right.
And you would see benefits. And there are other things that we can learn from the trauma based work is that it's usually not in the inmate's best interest to be put back into the same zip code, you know, the same environment that they came
Right.
from. If it's a high risk thing, they need to be put in places that maybe they're more rural, or maybe they're places that not necessarily in the city, you know, where they have these bad experiences, but be put someplace that's safer, because that's an easy thing to remove. The environmental side of it is easy to not put them back in the same place. So I think it's easier, you know, I don't actually do that work, but it's that is the type of, I definitely agree with you. And you know, currently I think that we're, you know, you definitely, everyone in the prison would benefit from trauma therapy. We currently still don't understand whether there's this theory that there's two types of psychopaths. One is the primary, they come from biology and genetics and they're just immutable and they're going to be like that way no matter what. And then there's the secondary psychopathic pathway, which is supposed to be more from a trauma based thing that kind of has developed or suppressed the development of these limbic circuits. And then the behaviors manifest and they score high on psychopathy. And the best studies that I've seen, and we've contributed a bit to this, is kind of going to be like a 70-30 split. So 70% of the population is primary and 30% is secondary. Although that's kind of, it's difficult to come up with how to define,
But
their trauma history.
trauma would likely be a case in both of these. It's just explain maybe the difference, because if there's
Yeah.
environmental trauma primarily in both, right?
So there could be. The point is that there's two. The point is that some people believe there's two groups of psychopaths. One that is primarily driven by biology, and
Right,
trauma could
primary.
have
Okay,
happened or not. And then the other one is driven by, the environment, and that's the so-called secondary. And the secondary is typically differentiated from the primary through anxiety. So it would be an individual. So the primaries have low anxiety. They have basically very little concern or worry, and they're a low anxious individual
right.
versus somebody who has all of the traits but is more high anxious. And there's a variety of ways of people have tried to assess anxiety, but when you try to break it up, high, low, anxious, however you try to come up with a split of those that score really high, it's kind of a 70-30 or even 80-20, so that the secondary is more in the minority. And what that means is that one way to interpret that data would say is that it's hard to make somebody get these traits. It has to be a long, prolonged, chronic, kind of, you know, trauma or bad environment or environment conducive to the development of these traits, and that is leads, in a small minority of individuals to the development of these traits and the expression of these traits in all domains of their life.
The Giant Shoulder mission is to explore radical ideas in biology, neuroscience, and consciousness, and elevate those stories to the highest possible level while keeping them accessible to everyone. If this interests you and you want to support independent science, then please consider subscribing to the Clips channel